right, folks, we are back here on WLTH 1370 AM, Free Speech Friday, Issues and Answers. I'm Scott Cannon. Reverend Delwyn Campbell could not be here with us today. Yeah, I'm sorry. Rev had Reverend duties and is currently, well, he may have just landed. He was on a plane and now I think he may have recently landed. So hopefully he will be back with us next Friday, 6 to 8 p.m. right here. Same bat time, same bat channel. A very important story. I wanted to do this with the Rev too. Because I really believe, if I'm not mistaken, that he came to this show. I started this show on Valentine's Day 2020. I believe he came to this show in July of 2020. July or August of 2020, sometime during the summer of 2020. While this was going on, he was starting the protest, the racial justice protest, the George Floyd protest, the Black Lives Matter protest, as you want to call them, were breaking out all over the country when he first got here, and those are some of the first stories we covered together. Were from the George Floyd protest, and I remember us talking about it at the time that some of these protests were becoming totally unproductive. It's totally unproductive to have the level of violence and sort of the constant fighting with the police in the middle of the street, because at a certain point you lose the moral high ground and you lose people's sympathy. And I remember around the summer, because George Floyd was murdered in April or May, if I'm not mistaken, and the protests started to break out in May or June, something like that. At the peak of those protests, Black Lives Matter had an 80% approval rating in this country. People were with them. Even Republicans had to admit. You saw Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson at least feigning outrage at the George Floyd murder, right? But these protests kept going on and in perpetuity into the summer. And I remember thinking, they're blowing it. They're absolutely blowing it. And you saw it, the approval ratings of the movement started to sort of fizzle out the longer all these protests went on. And so now we're starting to see a clear picture 3 years later, almost 3 years later, of a lot of what happened during this while this was happening. You know, the Intercept, actually, which is a really good website that does a lot of great investigative journalism, has actually broken the case of how the FBI was actually behind some of the more violent outcomes during 2020, when all those protests were happening all in American cities. They particularly got one informant who was in Denver, Colorado, where they weren't just upset about George Floyd's death in Minnesota. They had their own tragic police killing, one of Elijah McClain. We talked about his death here on this show too, I believe 3 years ago when it happened as well. This was the young man who was very nerdy. I think he may have been gay. I don't know. He certainly had a very feminine way about him. And he was just walking peacefully, and he started having some sort of an asthma attack or something. And he was actually injected with a lethal dose of ketamine by, if I'm not mistaken, the paramedics or the police, one of the two. So his death was in 2019, and there was already some outrage about that. George Floyd's was in 2020, and there was outrage about that. In the midst of all this, a man named Michael Adam Windecker II, nicknamed Mickey, This was a man who boasted of having been a soldier for the French Foreign Legion and the Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighting force known most recently for battling the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. He claimed to have traveled to those battlefields and trained anti-fascist activists there in weapons and hand-to-hand combat. This man drove a silver hearse. I'm trying to picture this very pudgy white man covered in tattoos who drives a hearse around Denver, Colorado. Now this man, inside his hearse, he had lots of guns. He had AR-15s, which are the very controversial guns, the Armalite rifles that you see politicians always trying to ban whenever a mass shooting happens, because those are the type of guns that usually you see in a lot of the mass shootings, like in Las Vegas and in other shootings. So this man was carrying lots of guns in his silver hearse, and it has come out that the FBI actually paid him tens of thousands of dollars in cash to infiltrate and spy on racial justice groups during the summer of 2020. The FBI payment receipt records signed by Mr. Windecker show that he was paid more than $20,000 for his work during the summer of 2020, when the FBI aggressively pursued racial justice and left-wing activists. While on the FBI payroll, Windecker became an organizer of Denver's racial justice demonstrations and ultimately undermined the social movement, gaining momentum there by deploying the same controversial tactics that the FBI used against black political groups during the civil rights movement. So we're talking about COINTELPRO, y'all. Mr. Windecker offered to give the FBI information about protesters, and in an internal report, the FBI claimed that his motivation for becoming an informant was, in his words, to fight terrorists, and that he believed people who participate in violent civil unrest are terrorists. Now, mind you, Mr. Windecker is just one of more than 15,000 informants that is on record that the FBI has. The FBI has more than 15,000 informants. Just think about that, you guys. 15,000, at least 15,000. Who knows? Some of them might be here in Gary. I don't know. Windecker's history as both an informant and a criminal. Should I say he has a history as an informant and a criminal, with prior arrests in Colorado, Nevada, Texas, and Florida for crimes including sexual assault. So this man is not even like some sort of, clean-cut, choir boy who just wants to help his government. This guy is a sexual predator. He was 20 years old when he had a sexual relationship with a 14-year-old girl that he met at a roller skating rink. And for that, he only spent 180 days in jail. In another case, he was charged with felony menacing with a weapon. He stuck a gun in a woman's face and claimed to be a police officer looking for a suspect. That incident resulted in a felony conviction, and Windecker served 2 years in prison. While he was in prison, according to FBI internal reports, another inmate tried to hire him to murder someone. Now, instead of committing this crime, Windecker became a cooperating witness and helped convict the people who sought to enlist him. So he became a professional snitch. In addition to criminal charges, Windecker has had 4 protection orders filed against him in Colorado, the most recent 2 years ago. In a petition for a protection order filed in 2016, a friend of Windecker's alleged that Windecker had presented a fake police badge and threatened to kill him and his family. Wow. Now this is astonishing. What's been publicly known about the federal government's activity during the summer of 2020 is astonishing. The Justice Department charged hundreds of people for their roles in First Amendment protected demonstration. The Department of Homeland Security deployed more than 750 agents, often dressed in military-style uniforms, to Portland. The FBI abducted demonstrators in unmarked vans, and the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, using surveillance powers intended to stop drug runners, spied on more than 50 racial justice groups nationwide. Among them, a peaceful group that held a vigil on a public university campus in Florida. Now, the official position of the FBI, whose undercover activities during the summer of 2020 have been largely unknown until now, is that their agents do not open investigations based on First Amendment protected activities. Now we see that it's not the case, folks. But internal reports suggest otherwise. They show that Windecker's information was about speech, and this apparently justified hiring him as an informant and launching the undercover investigation. Now, how did he do this? He gained prominence among the protesters, eventually rising to a leadership role. He was accusing real activists, listen to this, he was accusing real activists of being informants. He was doing that. The baseless accusations sowed mistrust and undermined some of the most effective organizers in that community. There was a young black man named Trey Quinn who was leading protests in Denver, who was among the first to suspect that Windecker might be an informant. Quinn devised a way to test Windecker. Speaking in hypotheticals, he asked him about burning down a neighborhood, asking him, could we get it done? And Windecker was like, oh yeah, I got the right guy for the job. So that should always be a giveaway for all you who are listening. When somebody is possibly in bed with the feds, because they're going to try to get you to go further and further and further and do far more criminal and violent things so that they can entrap you. So always be on the lookout for that. So this activist actually trapped Windecker and exposed him a little bit. He didn't actually get to expose, but he essentially found him out, figured him out by asking him if he could help him burn down the neighborhood. Now, Windecker's enthusiastic response to this request about burning down the neighborhood, it fueled Trey Quinn's suspicions, but he did not have proof that Windecker was a rat, so he didn't warn the other activists then. But Windecker, and this shows you how slimy Windecker is, he viewed Quinn as a threat to his cover, so he started telling the other activists that Quinn was working for the FBI. Isn't that a snitch? Isn't that a rat? Oh my God. So now, Trey Quinn, this young black man from Denver who has to live in his community, he finds himself on the outside of the activist community because they stopped communicating with him. His fellow activists stopped communicating with him. Quinn is on the outside, and Windecker is encouraging protesters to become more militant and go on the offensive against the police. From August 22nd to August 29, 2020, a series of demonstrations morphed into assault on police stations, with protesters carrying homemade shields and hurling rocks and fireworks at police. The demonstrators called one of these events "Give 'em Hell," and more than 70 police officers were injured that week. The police response was ferocious. Officers in riot gear broke bones and fired pepper balls and rubber bullets. One man was hit in the head with a lead-filled beanbag fired from a police shotgun. A sting ball grenade exploded next to a woman, knocking out her teeth. In the first civil judgment awarded at trial for police brutality in response to protests triggered by the Floyd killing, Denver police were forced last spring to pay $14 million to 12 protesters. According to more than a dozen activists, Windecker, the FBI informant, helped and organized these protests where all the violence happened. According to FBI files and videos, Windecker's mandate from the FBI wasn't just to provide information about racial justice protesters, though his intelligence about activists filled dozens of reports, but also to try to set up protesters in a conspiracy that would have supported Donald Trump's claims about, the left being Antifa and violent and everything. Many of the activist groups in Denver have splintered or disbanded since this situation happened, which is always the goal. This has always been the goal ever since back in the 1960s when they did this to the Black Panther Party. So the activist groups, the true activists, disbanded and splintered their groups. Now, they had always suspected that government agents had infiltrated the groups to encourage the violence that occurred, but they never had proof until now. My God. And there you have it, folks. There you have it. This is exactly what they did to the Black Panthers many years ago. They turned Eldridge Cleaver against Huey Newton. When Cleaver was away in Africa, they started spreading disinformation between him and the Oakland Panthers, which were Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. We saw this with the Nation of Islam, how the FBI infiltrated. We saw this in all the civil rights groups, the NAACP. We saw it with Fred Hampton, obviously. They just made a movie about them infiltrating the Black Panthers with Fred Hampton in Chicago, the Judas and the Black Messiah, that just came out. I didn't even want to watch that movie. I'm going to keep it real with you. I know it won a whole bunch of awards and got a whole lot of critical acclaim, and I love movies. But I'm sick and tired of watching movies about black people losing. I'm sorry. I'm sick and tired of watching movies about black people losing. I'm sick of watching slavery movies for the same reason. And so, yeah, you see this type of infiltration of the FBI. And this is why, let me say this, when you started seeing some weeks ago or a few months ago about the Republicans talking about they want to disband the FBI, and you start seeing liberals on CNN and MSNBC defending the FBI, defending these people here, Democrats, black people, you see black people defending the FBI. Oh, well, they just don't want them to investigate Trump. Yeah, sure, fine. I agree with that. I agree with that. But the FBI has never done anything for our community except for murder our leaders and disrupt our civil rights organizations. I don't care who gets rid of them, whether it's the Republicans, whether it's the Democrats, whoever. Good riddance. For almost 50 years, they let J. Edgar Hoover terrorize the black community. He let the mafia get away with murder while he was trying to make Martin Luther King kill himself. He told Martin Luther King if he didn't kill himself, he was going to expose all kinds of stuff, and he was going to do this, and threaten him and everything else. If he did not kill himself. And yet you have black people who open their mouths up and defend the FBI. And the CIA too. You could turn on the news any given day and see Malcolm Nance, these spooks, over there selling whatever narratives that they're trying to sell. These are the organizations that they work for. This is why John F. Kennedy wanted to get rid of them. A lot of people believe that's why he was killed. I don't know exactly why he was killed, but I would not be surprised. There actually was a church committee in the mid-70s that exposed a lot of the COINTELPRO program and a lot of things like that. And supposedly they had cleaned it up, but as we see now, they didn't. They did not. Two years ago, me and the Rev actually did the story about. We actually did the story about the break-in to the FBI headquarters, where some left-wing activists actually broke into the FBI headquarters during the Muhammad Ali Joe Frazier fight in 1971, which was the fight of the century. And that's the only reason why we found out about COINTELPRO, because those activists stole the files from the FBI headquarters and exposed them, and we got to see the full extent of the evil things that they were doing. Whoever gets rid of them, it won't be quick enough. All right, folks, when we come back, we're going to talk about some COVID stuff, vitamin D, and its effect on COVID and other things when we get back. Please stick with us here on WLTH 1370 AM.